In this webinar, we're going to talk a little bit about the self-assessment of core competencies. So we have the opportunity to communicate and report to parents in a more flexible, responsive way, according to the interim reporting policy. And the goal of that policy is that our communicating student learning and reporting process would be more timely, responsive, build student ownership, and involve parents. So this policy requires that students in K-9 participate in a self-assessment of core competencies. So in this session, we'll talk a little bit about what the purpose and the rationale of that self-assessment of core competencies is, how we incorporate core competencies in our teaching, how we prepare students for the self-assessment, what the final self-assessment might look like, and some possible ways of documentation. So let's consider, what might be the rationale and purpose of a self-assessment of core competencies as part of the reporting process? So some of the rationale and purpose of the self-assessment of core competencies is really to reflect the importance of the self-assessment process. We know in the literature it talks a lot about the power of self-assessment for students, and the ultimate goal of assessment, any assessment, is to prepare the students to be able to do that process for themselves. We know the purpose is to help build student ownership of the core competencies, and ultimately ownership of their learning. The students an opportunity for student voice, support the development of students' reflective skills, metacognition, and the ability to set their own learning goals. And the opportunity to look at the learner in a more holistic way. Often in schools we assess or report on individual aspects. This allows us to pull everything together and really talk about the learner in a more holistic way. So when we're self-assessing the core competencies, what do we need to consider and think about? Well, we need to think about how we're incorporating those core competencies in our teaching, right, in a day-to-day kind of way. How we're building student ownership and voice, and ensuring that this is a meaningful process for students. At the end of the day, we want to be sure that the self-assessment that students participate in is one that is purposeful, that is meaningful to the student, and that the student values. This slide just shows a little bit of the connection of the curricular competencies to the core competencies. And you can see in this slide some of the ways that it connects. Using reasoning and logic, synthesizing ideas, compare and contrast. These were actually taken from 5 different areas of learning: English language arts, social science, the arts, and English language arts. So this just shows the connection. So when we're teaching, and we're using the curricular competencies to build learning experiences for our kids, we're really helping them to develop the core competencies. So one of the things that we need to pay attention to when we are planning those learning experiences is the core competencies and the level of intentionality that we want to be sure we're engaging in. We want to think about how those core competencies take expression in different disciplines. If I'm communicating in math, it's very different than when I'm communicating in language arts. Or the thinking processes I use in science in that inquiry base are very different than the thinking processes that I engage in when I'm thinking in social studies and looking at bias and perspective and cause and effect. So I want to be thinking about that and intentionally planning in my learning experiences for those sorts of notions. I want to be sure that the goals and the targets I set for my kids show that connection back to the core competencies. I'm building my classroom and school community. Right from day one, we intentionally ensure that our kids understand our classroom community and our school community, and what the kinds of behaviors, how we interact with others, how we solve conflict, how all of those things are present in our classroom. and those link directly back to our personal and our social competencies. We want to be sure that we focus on them. We want to be sure that when there's opportunities, we teach different aspects of them so that kids are well aware of those personal and social competence in our classrooms and in their community. One of the things I believe is important is using the language of the core competencies and really helping students understand what the different core competencies look like. What does thinking look like? What are the different ways that we think? What are the different ways that people process? What does good communication look like? What does good collaboration look like? How do I do that in a way that gets me the goals that I'm interested in? How do we contribute positively to the classroom environment? What do we do when we want to generate lots of ideas? What strategies do we use when we're frustrated or angry? And how do we collaborate effectively with others? These are all taken from the facets of the core competencies. So we want to be sure that we're making these explicit in our classroom. We want to notice them, name them, nurture them, and celebrate them when kids demonstrate them. So there's some of the connections between the curricular and the core and how I want to be intentional and explicit in my classroom. Let's think about some of the ways that we can support students to be prepared for a meaningful self-assessment process. The literature is really clear on the importance of self-assessment, and we want to be sure that we're giving students lots and lots of opportunities to gain the language of reflection, to gain those metacognitive skills, and to have lots of experience self-assessing in lots of different ways. We want to do that throughout the school year. Encourage students to talk about their attributes, their skills, and their proficiencies in relation to the core competencies. Those open-ended questions that are important, that prompt student reflection and help them gain the language in order to be metacognitive. We want to provide greater opportunities for students to self-assess the core competencies throughout the school year in all different areas of learning. We want to involve students throughout the year in those self-assessment opportunities and really help them better understand who they are and the ways that they are unique. One of the things that can be helpful is to look at some of the facets of the core competencies and to build some open-ended prompts that we can use as frames to help ask those kinds of questions of students. Can you describe some ways you've collaborated with others? That directly connects to the communication core competency. What strategies do you use when you want to generate lots of ideas? Talk about something you've designed in an area of learning. What do you see as your personal strengths? Can you talk about a time when you exercised some good choices that contributed to your well-being? How have you improved this year in building relationships with others? What goals have you met that you are proud of? So these were just taken from the facets of the core competencies as just a way to start building those open-ended frames and prompts that really help students be reflective, understand the core competencies, and more importantly, understand who they are and where they are in relation to the core competencies and how they take expression in themselves in the unique ways. So we talked a little bit about the connection between the core and the curricular and the importance of the self-assessment. I think the most important question we can ask ourselves now is how do we create a process for students at the end of the year that is meaningful when they come to assess the core competencies. It's really important, I believe, that at the end of the year when students participate in this process that they see it really as valuable, meaningful, and really as a way of celebrating who they are, how they're unique. It's about their competencies, not their incompetencies, so it's very strength-based and really helps them better able to describe the skills and attributes that they have. So these are just some options that teachers have talked to me about as possible ways of completing this self-assessment at the end of the year. So one of the teachers that I was working with was thinking of a portfolio review at the end of the year where they would invite the parent in, and they had been working with a portfolio assessment process. And the student would talk with their parent about their portfolio, pulling out some evidence from the portfolio, and really speaking to how that evidence in their portfolio connected to the core competencies and some of the things that they had learned about themselves. While the student was talking about themselves in relation to the core competencies, the teacher would be taking some notes down as to what the student said and perhaps some learning goals, and that would be the summary of the self-assessment. We know that sometimes with our youngest learners, asking them to do it in written form it wouldn't be the best or isn't the best way for them to describe themselves. So sitting down and using some of those open-ended prompts, having a conversation with the student and making a summary, a reflective summary of that conversation, that could then be their self-assessment. Involving the parent is a wonderful opportunity. So using that student-led conference as a forum for discussion on the students and their core competencies, the self-assessment of the core competencies, and creating a summary of that conference and that conversation. A video, I think, one of the things that I think would be wonderful as a student would be to have a series of videos over the course of my schooling where I'm describing myself in relation to the core competencies that was completed at the end of the year at different grade levels. And I think there's examples of those kinds of videos you can find on the illustrated examples on the website, ministry website on the core competencies, where the student really just speaks about who they are in relation to the core competencies, some of the challenges they've faced, some of the successes they've had, what their skills and attributes are, and what their learning goals are for the future. So I think when we're working with our students, we really want to be sure that we're noticing them, naming them, nurturing them, and giving students lots of opportunities to demonstrate them. We want to be sure we're focusing on them when we're building learning experiences, that we're being intentional, that we're modeling, that we're providing guided practice, and we're supporting students in developing the core competencies. That we're using the language with kids. We're helping kids develop the language of reflection, understand the language of the core competencies, and incorporating lots of opportunities for self-assessment in our classroom. And one of our ultimate goals is that we build student ownership and voice, and that we support the development of the metacognition and the students' ability to speak to who they are, what their skills and attributes are, and what they bring to their journey and to their path forward. So I think when it comes to documenting that can be a fairly simple way of noting it on the bottom of the report card, the date of the parent-teacher conference, putting a copy of the summary, attaching that to the report card, putting the date of the portfolio review. If it is a written reflection, it can be attached to the report card, a copy of it. All of those sorts of ways would meet the requirement for documentation. If it's a video, a URL could be placed at the bottom of the report card so the parent knows where to access it. It could be emailed home to a parent, and that could be noted on the report card. So I think all those ways would meet the requirement. The important thing at the end of the day is that that process is thoughtful and that it ties back to our goal of building student ownership, student voice. It's a meaningful process, and it's one that student values. And I think we need to be really mindful of some of the things that we do so that we meet that goal. We have the opportunity to share some practices and learn from each other and have lots of conversation before we get to June and have to complete the self-assessment. In the meantime, we're doing all of those things to prepare students for the process. As far as the interim reporting policy goes, we know that there's wider parent consultation that's underway, surveys, community forums, and some focus groups. And then at some point there'll be a move to a final student progress order for K to 9. So I think that this opportunity to incorporate student self-assessment as a requirement of their reporting is a wonderful opportunity to really ensure that this is a process that includes our students. So thank you.